What's up, YouTube? This is Too Raw for TV. All right, so I just checked out the new Eddie Murphy documentary on Netflix called Being Eddie, and it's about I think 1 hour and 47 minutes long. So it's a little bit lengthy. Um, and I've always been an Eddie Murphy fan ever since the '80s. So there's a lot of things that I've learned about Eddie Murphy over the years. But there's a few things I learned in this documentary that I did not know before. And I was not aware that, for instance, his biological father was unalived under somewhat mysterious circumstances involving a domestic incident, not involving his mother, but I guess, or Eddie Murphy, his brother's biological mother, but I guess some woman that he was involved with at the time. I think the incident occurred in the 60s, late 60s. His adoptive father, I think his name was Vernon, and he lived from 1933 to 2001. And I believe he was a former boxer. And either he was a former boxer or his father was a former boxer, one of the two. But anyway, that's the man who raised Eddie Murphy, Charlie Murphy, and the other brother. And Eddie was born in Brooklyn, but grew up in Long Island. And, Eddie was a very precocious kid. He loved watching television. He loved mimicry. One of the things I learned about Eddie Murphy is that he appeared to have OCD when he was growing up, obsessive compulsive disorder. He would talk about how he would, obsessively check knobs to make sure that things were turned off and doors were locked, and always checking things, always obsessed with detail. And so he was also he had this noise he would make, this humming sound. And then when he got a little bit older and he learned about what obsessive compulsive disorder is, and so it was described as a mental disorder, I guess the vanity in him said, "Oh hell no, I ain't got no mental disorder." So he forced himself to stop doing certain things. He says that even now today, he has to stop himself from like at night. He'll check to see, make sure everything's off, like the stove, whatever, the knobs, everything's turned off on the stove. And he said, he'll make sure it's turned off, and then he'll go to bed. And a part of him wanted to go back up and check it. He said, "Nah, motherfucker, don't start that shit up again." So I thought that was interesting. But it focused a little bit on his childhood, but it really focused more on his career. How he started off on Saturday Night Live. He was only 18 or something, 19. I think when he started on Saturday Night Live, 18 or 19. And before that, he didn't really. Well, actually, I'm skipping over a few things. He didn't really start becoming interested in the concept of doing stand-up until he was 13. And then I think he started doing stand-up when he was 15. His act really became more honed by the time he was 17. And by age 19, he was on Saturday Night Live. Now, he came on the scene almost immediately after that Not Ready for Primetime players of Dan Aykroyd, John Belushi, Bill Murray, Jane Curtin, Garrett Morris, Gilda Radner. When that crew left, I think it was one season afterwards where it was these whack, I don't want to call it whack, but it was this season after with an awful entertainers, but Eddie Murphy was one of the ones that shined. Him and Joe Piscopo, and they were the only ones that were retained for the next season. But then Eddie Murphy became the breakaway star on Saturday Night Live, the breakaway star. So much so that I think he's the only cast member in history to be a cast member and host at the same time. You've had cast members leave, become stars, and come back and host, but Eddie was still a cast member when he hosted the show. And, he started doing movies, of course, Another 48 Hours, hit. Trading Places, hit. And, there was still this stigma that, well, Eddie's doing hit movies, but we had never really seen a black lead make a hit movie on his own. So when Beverly Hills Cop came along, there was some trepidation, like, well, damn, should we give it to Eddie? I don't know if a black guy could lead. And the movie wound up being number one in the box office for unprecedented 14 weeks. I think it made like $200-some million, which back in the 80s was super blockbuster. So that killed that notion. And, Eddie did talk about the fact that, look, before me, you only could have one black hot actor at a time. In the 60s, it was Sidney Poitier. In the 70s, it was mostly, Richard Pryor. Then it was him. But then he said after him, the floodgates began to open up. So you start seeing more and more minority, in this situation, black entertainers popping up. And, that's something that Eddie doesn't get a lot of credit for. Eddie, in my opinion, also doesn't get enough credit for the versatility that he has shown in his career. He is a tremendous stand-up comic. Although he hasn't done it in a long time, he's a tremendous stand-up comic. He's a tremendous sketch comedian. When he was younger, he was a really good physical comedian. Although I'm not saying he was, that wasn't the main part of his act, but he could be a tremendous physical comedian. He's a great dramatic actor. He's a musician. If Eddie Murphy was white, he would be absolutely idolized as the great one. They would call him the great one. But, it is what it is. Then they talked about how they showed when Eddie Murphy made that statement at the Oscars in 1988, where, look, as black entertainers, we're no longer just going to ride the rear anymore. We're not going to just come up and be, satisfied with coming up on the rear, basically like we're coming. And it's almost like the Oscars punished him for saying something like that, for being uppity. And they've always sort of pigeonholed him out when it comes to awards. And then, look, they could never get Eddie on the usual things they can get people like him for. Like, they couldn't get him on, drugs. They couldn't get him on alcohol. They couldn't get him on domestic abuse. They couldn't get him on being, or showcasing criminality. He didn't fit the pattern they wanted him to follow, so they could trap him. So they attacked Eddie on the one thing that was near and dear to him, and that was his craft, aka his career. They started saying that, oh, well, he's lost his luster. His movies, they're not hits anymore. His star is fading. Even his alma mater, Saturday Night Live, I remember when it actually aired, and I was like shocked that they did that. When David Spade do his Weekend Update segment on Saturday Night Live, it was late 1995, and they showed a picture of Eddie Murphy, and he said, "Oh, look, kids, a falling star." And I was shocked that they did that because Eddie Murphy comes from Saturday Night Live. I knew that at age 15. I said, wow, that sucks that they did that. And of course, Eddie Murphy was irate when that happened. He called up there because he knew that joke had to be cleared from the top. So that led to a more than 20-year rift between Eddie Murphy and his alma mater, Saturday Night Live. And then, it's like everybody turned on Eddie, man. Then, even though the documentary doesn't talk about it, they had the incident in 1997 with the I'll just say the streetwalker that wound up being, a transformer. And they tried to attach that to him and destroy him with that. And, it's really sad, man, because look, a lot of the movies that they pan as awful that he did, I loved. I like Vampire in Brooklyn. I think it's very funny. They tried to downplay the Nutty Professor movies, which were funny. They tried to tell you that Norbit wasn't funny. And what's so funny about Norbit is the powers to, when I say the powers to be, I mean people who hold grudges, who okays for certain articles be written because they have a grudge against Eddie or they got a bone to pick with him about stuff. They used the Norbit Project to erase what greatness he showed in the movie Dreamgirls. They used Norbit to weaponize, which, by the way, Norbit was hella funny. If you actually sit back and watch it, you know how many people I've encountered who said Norbit sucks, but yet when I asked them about it, they never sat down and watched the damn movie. And then when they actually watch Norbit, they tell me how funny it is. That's the power of the media. They'll tell you what to believe. They'll tell you how to think and how to eat. These people don't know our culture like that. You can't tell me what's funny, what's good. I'll dictate what I think is good. You don't tell me what a bunch of white snobs who, you know what I'm saying, have a certain culture. And I'm not saying there's something wrong with that, but you're not going to tell me what I think is funny culturally. So it culminates, the documentary culminates with his return to Saturday Night Live in 2019. Basically, he came 360. And from the beginning of his career to that point, and his career continues. And, when you look at the 1980s, and you look at some of the giants of that time, Eddie's one of the last remaining when you think about it. You have Eddie Murphy, you have Madonna, who's still here, but then again, you have Whitney Houston and Prince and Michael. They're not here. And Eddie lacked that self-destructive gene that many of them had, man. But anyway, I found it a very good watch. It was very entertaining. Tell me what you guys think.